Well, howdy, everyone, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I'm your host, Austin Halverson, and thank you for joining me. We are back today with part two on the legendary rancher, Teddy Roosevelt. And, a lot of people say that he's a man who probably does not need an introduction, but, contrary to that belief, I think there's a lot of things that people don't know about him, which is why I split this series into a few parts and spent the first part of it talking about who Teddy Roosevelt was. He was much more than just the President of the United States. He had a storied career before that, before even he charged up San Juan Hill. There's a lot to Teddy Roosevelt that's not necessarily known by the general public. So I hope you enjoyed that backstory. And, we covered his life essentially up until he bought the ranch to provide that perspective. But part two is going to cover his actual operation of the ranch and his experiences while in the Badlands. And then I'm actually going to have a part three, which will actually be the end of his time in the Badlands and the legacy of that time spent there, because that's probably the most lasting impact is what happened after he left. He's really only there for a total of 4 years. But we'll start after a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll get into what happened when Teddy Roosevelt went west. Well, I'm proud to welcome the newest sponsor for the Rancher Podcast, and that is Elite Ranch Consulting. They are your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you are already working, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can protect your American dream. When his father had died, Roosevelt inherited a fortune worth around $1.5 million today, which isn't a ton of money. It's not something that necessarily you could live the rest of your life on at the age of 23, in the way that Roosevelt lived his life. Again, he was one of the members of high society in New York, and of course was not very good with money. So he had this nice inheritance, and he also was making a pretty good salary as an assemblyman. Now, for perspective, his assemblyman salary, if I remember correctly, is only somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, which, of course, back then was a good yearly salary. But keep that in perspective when you start hearing some of these numbers about the things that he did, because that's essentially $100 a month. And one of my favorite quotes from the book that I listened to on Audible, entitled Roosevelt in the Badlands, is that no man got into ranching faster than Teddy Roosevelt. And, like I said, he was very generous with his money, and he rarely thought out his financial decisions, nor based them off of what we would consider traditional economic factors. I know that multiple times he would write to his bankers and friends and financiers and accountants and tell them about what he was doing, and they might question it a bit, and he would always say, "Oh, no, it's going to be great," and he would go off and do whatever he wanted with his money. So, really, he invested in what he thought things were worth. And one of the stories that I like to think of is that he would quickly just hand out $100 bills to hunting guides and cowhands alike when he shot game animals, or they helped him round up his cattle. I think I mentioned in part one there was a specific story where when he first went hunting in the Badlands, he quite literally shot, an elk and a bison and pronghorn, and immediately just started shelling out $100 bills. And there was another story where he went out hunting with the son of one of his partners in the ranch, and he shot pronghorn, I believe, and immediately tried to gift the gun to the young man. And the young man was kind of wise beyond his years. He he didn't really want to take the gun because he thought this guy's gonna take this back whenever his nerves settle, which actually probably wouldn't have been true. I'm sure that Roosevelt would have let him keep the gun, but just again, like the extravagance of gifts, the fact that he gave men $14,000, men that he had barely even known, to start the ranch, when that was a lot of money at the time, especially for someone who only makes about $1,500 a year. To shell out 14 grand to somebody you don't really know to get into the cow business was quite the investment. And anyone who's familiar with the cow business knows that financial discipline is a crucial key to success. There's always that joke that says, how do you make $1 million or how do you become a millionaire as a cattle owner? And it says you start as a billionaire. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. And Teddy didn't really seem to care. He handed the $14,000, like I said, to a man named Sylvain Ferris and Mr. Bill Merrifield, and he told him he wanted to get into the cattle business. So essentially what he had done was he had bought their ranch for the 14 grand, a little less than that actually, probably closer to 11 or 12 grand went to the ranch, and that was known as Chimney Butte or the Maltese Cross. Now, the difference in name is because the Maltese Cross was the brand. And if you think of, a grid axis, essentially an X or a T with little lines on the ends, that's what a Maltese Cross is. And so he bought their ranch, and then the rest of the money was supposed to go towards going over to the Midwest, Minnesota, Chicago, those areas, and getting cattle herds for their new piece of land and their new venture. And that was that. Teddy Roosevelt was now a cowman. He showed up in Dakota Territory, went hunting, and he left a owner of a ranch. So his penchant for throwing around money really quickly made him quite a few friends in the small town of Medora. And I'm sure that these old cowboys and plainsmen, much like the young man who went hunting with him, were happy to take this East Coast silver spooner's cash, but probably were a little bit wary of where that money was coming from and how long it would last. And I think that they also really underestimated his character, his determination, and his passion because of that. I think they just thought of him as just another one of these East Coast, dudes, if you will, that wanted to kind of play the part for a little while and didn't really want to get their hands dirty, but wanted to say they were cattlemen. And I mean, I'm not going to say that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't trying to play at this like it was a game, but he definitely had more passion and was willing to get the work done that most of his East Coast counterparts probably wouldn't. And many notable events changed the perspective of these folks about Mr. Roosevelt, but one of my favorites is from his autobiography, and it addresses a fight that he had, and here's his own words on what happened that evening. He was in a bar room, and I came up, and I disliked going in, but there was nowhere else to go, and it was a cold night. Inside the room were several men who, including the bartender, were wearing the kind of smile worn by men who are making believe to like what they don't like. A shabby individual in a broad hat with a cocked gun in each hand was walking up and down the floor, talking with strident profanity. He had evidently been shooting at the clock, which had 2 or 3 holes in its face. As soon as he saw me, he hailed me as Four Eyes in reference to my spectacles, and said, "Four Eyes is going to treat." I joined in the laugh and got behind the stove and sat down, thinking to escape notice. He followed me, however, and though I tried to pass it off as a jest, merely made him more offensive towards me. And he stood leaning over me, gun in each hand, using very foul language. In response to his reiterated command that I should set up drinks, I said, "Well, if I've got to, I've got to," and rose, looking past him. As I rose, I struck quick, hard and right, my right just to one side of his point of his jaw, hitting with my left as it straightened out, and then again with my right. He fired the guns, but I do not know whether this was merely a convulsive action of his hands or whether he was trying to shoot at me. When he went down, he struck the corner of the bar with his head. If he had moved, I was about to drop on my knees, but he was senseless. I took away his guns, and other people in the room, who were now loud in their denunciation of him, hustled him out and put him in the shed. So this is probably quite a shock for a bunch of these folks who considered him really a city slicker, but they didn't know about his boxing years at Harvard, and he basically took care of the town bully that night, and I think that really endeared him to the folks of the Badlands and the Dakota Territory because they realized that they had more in common with him and that his rigid sense of right and wrong kind of fit their own in a land that was pretty lawless at the time. But an interesting thing about it was that Roosevelt wasn't the only outsized personality taking up ranching in Medora. There was a man, his name was Antoine Amédée Vincent Maca Amat de Vallambrose de Moray et Montemaggiore, which, if you shorten that down, he went by de Moray, or the Marquis de Moray, and he was a French marquis, which is a title of nobility that's directly below a duke, and he was a very interesting character. So Marquis de Moray attended the Saint Cyr Military Academy, which is kind of northwest part of France, near Nantes, if you will, and he was actually a really effective member of their cavalry unit there in France, and was also most famous for his dueling. He loved to duel, and I'm sure that these two passions, both the horses and the dueling, are what led him to the American West. And so he spent a little bit of time putting down rebellions in France's northern African colonies, and then headed out to the Dakota Territory in the mid-1880s when him and his wife, who he had just married, whose name was Medora, which is where the town's name comes from, moved to a ranch in the Badlands that was more than 45,000 acres. And, while Roosevelt may have seemed to be quite wealthy to folks on the plains, de Moray was really in an entirely different class of wealth. His family's wealth was, due to the fact that they owned land in France, and of course that's where the title comes from. But he was able to not just build his ranch, but he basically built the city of Medora. And if you go there today, you can take tours and learn more about the Marquis and Roosevelt and others. But interestingly enough, one of the things that he tried to do was bypass the Chicago meat packers. So, in business terms, we would call this vertical integration. He was trying to not only have the cattle and the ranch that run the cattle, but then also have the butchering, the meat packing occur on his land at his facilities before being shipped west directly to, I assume, wholesalers or restaurants or individuals. So you can actually see the remains of the abattoir that he built because they still stand in the town. And the other thing that you can visit is the ranch house that he lived in, which is known as the Chateau de Moray, which is a beautiful, turn of the century ranch home that's got, a beautiful porch, and it's immaculately preserved. So if you're ever in the southwest corner of, or the essentially western side of North Dakota, it's worth a visit. I have not been able to go, but my father, who's a native North Dakotan, has been and says it's a great place, and I do intend to visit at some point. But, as I mentioned earlier, Teddy had quickly ingratiated himself with the locals through his lovable nature and his money. But, there's this age-old question that Machiavelli first proposed, which is, should you be loved or feared? Which one is better, especially for a leader? And, while Teddy chose love, the Marquis chose the former. He kind of ruled the Badlands with somewhat of an iron fist. He imposed his will on others through his wealth or, through duels when money was not enough. And it was, he, he was respected and he was feared, but I don't think that he had the same rapport with the locals that Mr. Roosevelt had. And so, Roosevelt found a worthy adversary, but also an important partner in Desmarais because, of course, Desmarais owned essentially the town and he owned the abattoir and whatnot. And he also had the same goals as Roosevelt when it came to protecting his investments. So, as I mentioned, the Badlands were not really a place where there was much law enforcement, and they were pocked by unfriendly natives, the unruly cowboys, and every type of criminal from petty thieves to cattle rustlers. So Roosevelt and Desmarais struck up a partnership, and they came up with two different plans to protect their investment in their cattle. The first was to create a stockmen's association, which was formed and elected Roosevelt chairman in December of 1884. The group was known as the Stockmen of the Little Missouri, and that was, named after the ranch or the river that they ranched along. And it was comprised of essentially 12 ranching outfits who came together and created these bylaws. And what's really cool is you can actually see these bylaws online, which I'll read from here in a second. But it's very interesting. They said that this association shall be known as the Little Missouri River Stockmen's Association, and that the object of this association is to advance the interests of stock growers and dealers in livestock of all kinds in western Dakota, and for the purpose of the protection of the same against frauds, swindlers, and to prevent the stealing, taking, and driving away of horned cattle, sheep, horses, and other stock from the rightful owners thereof, and to enforce the stock laws of the territory of Dakota. So again, in the first two sections of these bylaws, you're already seeing that it's of the utmost importance to protect the investment and interests of these ranchers. So a little bit further down, they talk about how many times they should meet and whatnot. But further down, they talk about specifically, no member shall gather cattle on any range that is not his own during the months between December 1st and the date of the general spring roundup, without giving due notice a reasonable time ahead to the other ranchmen of this neighborhood. So, they were saying, hey, we're going to have a roundup when everybody goes out, and we'll sort the cattle out then. Because, of course, if you go out early, you might sneak off with a few cattle that belong to other folks. And so they didn't want that, especially if some of them hadn't been branded yet. And furthermore, they said, in order to attain greater efficiency in roundups, we hereby agree to place our men under the orders of the foreman of the roundup, so long as they remain with it, and in case of refusal by any man to do faithfully and well the duty assigned to him, or to obey orders given to him by the foreman in driving, cutting out, and other work, we hereby authorize the foreman of the roundup to prohibit any man so offending from any further participation in said work. So they laid out rules for the roundup, and the last few sections of this talk about how if you refuse to take part in the roundup in the Stockmen's Association, then essentially you cannot derive any of the benefits of that roundup. So pretty interesting document there. And Roosevelt was using his knowledge and his experience from being a state assemblyman to create law, if you will, in this lawless land. But what he really needed was a way to enforce it. And of course, crime is illegal almost anywhere, but there's a gray area that comes out of lack of enforcement. So Desmarais reached out to another noted cattleman, who I'm going to probably do an episode on, named Granville Stewart, to assist in the enforcement of these laws. So Stewart was an influential figure in neighboring Montana, and he formed a group that was, grimly known as Stewart's Stranglers, which is a pretty ominous name for anyone found to be on the wrong side of Mr. Granville and the rest of the Montana stock growers. So Roosevelt and Desmarais called in the stranglers to conduct what we consider frontier justice, and they ultimately decimated the cattle rustlers in the area. So I think that this kind of attests to the inclinations of both of these men, that they tried to join Stuart in this campaign. Teddy probably was doing this out of a thirst for adventure and justice, whereas Desmarais was doing it out of his drive to be successful, but also probably a little bit of bloodlust. But Stuart rightly suggested that having these two high-profile characters with him would ruin the element of surprise, and so they did not go on that trip. And it's estimated that Stuart's vigilante killed more than 20 rustlers throughout the mid-1880s. Interestingly enough, Roosevelt later admitted that he was glad that he had not taken part in the war on the rustlers, as it led to undue punishment and death on some of the targets. But I really don't think that the Marquis had the same change of heart. He probably would have enjoyed it, but again, that's just speculation. With law and order in place, though, and he had the land purchased and his cattle being raised, all that was left really for Roosevelt to do was earn a profit. But that would prove an even more daunting task than he believed at first. You see, the cattle growers had been fooled by Mother Nature in a very cruel way. The Badlands, which, again, you think about it, the name is the Badlands. But the Badlands that Roosevelt had seen and many others had seen in 1883 were not really a fair representation of what these lands typically looked like. Badlands are defined as essentially, like a desert, but are characterized by, in addition to being an arid climate, incredible erosion. That's why we see these beautiful picturesque vistas with lots of broken ground and coulees and towers of rock jutting up out of the into the sky, because this land is not grounded with any vegetation, and it erodes very quickly because of the poor soil. So they were trying to raise cattle on land that really wasn't capable of supporting them. And so this land had actually received record rains in the early 1880s, and that grass that they saw that was so lush during this time was not really going to stay long term. But on top of that, a North Dakota winter can be extraordinarily harsh. My father grew up there and describes the days below zero and the snow drifts, and it just, for a rancher, especially back before electricity, it could not have been an easy task. But as I mentioned earlier, Roosevelt was not really one to do due diligence on endeavors like this. And interestingly enough, in 1884, he had paid for one of his friends and a hunting guide who was from the Northeast, named Bill Sewell, along with Bill Sewell's son, to move to Medora to assist in the ranching. And he told Sewell at that time, he said, we're probably not going to make a profit in the first few years, but then I think the sky will be the limit. And ironically, it was the sky that chose that limit, and that limit proved to be through the floor. Because if you're not going to be able to make money in the next few years while the land is good, and they didn't know this, but it's not going to get any better. And funnily enough, there's a part in Roosevelt in the Badlands, the book, where Sewell recalls that he told Roosevelt early on in the move to Medora that he was not necessarily in the cattle business, that he didn't know too much about it, but that he didn't think that this was really much of cattle country. And Roosevelt quickly responded, he said, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You admitted you haven't ever been in the cattle business before. Everyone here believes that this is cattle country. And I think that he was really buying into the bias of these people who had also staked their hopes and dreams on this being cattle country, it's kind of like going to a Yankees game and asking them if the Yankees are the best team in the league. I mean, of course they're going to say yes. They're Yankees fans. You're in Yankee territory, and I just think that he fell victim to the hype, if you will, a term that we use today. And he was not thinking clearly. He was buying into the hopes and aspirations, and he was not listening to what essentially in Sewell was a third party observer. So that kind of spells the beginning of the end for Roosevelt in the Badlands. In mid 1884, Roosevelt and his men built a remote ranch house about 35 miles from the Maltese Cross headquarters and increased their herd to a few thousand head. He actually named the Elkhorn after skulls of two bull elk he found with their antlers locked together had died. So he named this little headquarters the Elkhorn after that. And this appeared to be a promising piece of land, but there was a problem. He was not the only one that thought it was a promising piece of land. Shortly after establishing his herd there, Roosevelt received a pretty curt letter from the Marquis saying that he had the right to the land because he had been grazing his sheep there in the year previous. So once again, Roosevelt's running afoul of the Marquis, the other titan in the area. And it was rumored that this letter had undertones of which seemed like a challenge to a duel, which, again, is quite likely considering that Marquis really enjoyed dueling and was not a good option for Roosevelt, considering, again, that he was very poor-sighted. I was reading the other day that he took meticulous notes on his hunting, and as I described in part one, it was not a great shot, and apparently it took him an average of 3 to 4 shots per animal, specifically, deer and pronghorns, to take them down, which is really quite terrible when you think about it. So a duel for Roosevelt would not have ended well, and instead of addressing the duel and whatnot, Roosevelt instead went and headed out on a long hunting expedition and removed his cattle from the area. And it was actually on this expedition that the fight that I mentioned occurred in the bar. And I can't help but wonder if he fought that fight in the bar as sort of a proxy in response to Marquis' challenge. It was a way of having a duel that he could win without having to fight against the Marquis. He earned a lot of respect. He didn't have to shoot anyone. He didn't have to risk being shot by a famous duelist. So I don't have anything to confirm that, but I thought that was really interesting that these events occurred in this time period so close together. And, that kind of is the end of his time in the Badlands. I mean, he was there for another year, and we're going to address that in part 3. But this time was very consequential, and I intend to go into the ending of the ranch in part 3. But I wanted you to understand him more as a man and more as a rancher, because you see, in the spring of 1886, there's one more story that I want to tell, and that's that in this spring, Roosevelt had his boat stolen from the Elkhorn. And again, I just want you guys to get a picture of his character before we move on to the end of the ranch in the next episode. So he gets this boat stolen by some local folks that, would be classified as ne'er-do-wells. And funnily enough, he says that he knew exactly who they were immediately. And he decided to hunt them down with his ranch hands, which were Wilmot Dow and Bill Sewell. And Roosevelt wrote quite a few books, and one of them was about his time in Dakota Territory. And interestingly enough, he talks about this hunting of the the thieves. And if you've ever seen Ken Burns' documentary on the Roosevelt family, this story even gets a small little snippet in there because it is so telling of Roosevelt's character. So he brought along these two men and a bunch of equipment, including a camera, to document the capture of the thieves. And here's what he had to say. He said, "There could have been no better men for a trip to this kind than my two companions, Sewell and Dow. They were tough, hardy, resolute fellows, quick as cats, strong as bears, and able to travel like a bull moose. For 3 days, the three men navigated the icy, winding river among the colorful clay buttes, hoping to take the thieves captive without a fight." A shootout was a concern for Roosevelt, who noted that the extraordinary formation of the Badlands, with the ground cut up into coulees, serried walls, and battlemented hilltops, makes it a country for all the others hiding places. However, Roosevelt was certain that these thieves would not suspect that he was in pursuit, for they had stolen essentially the only boat on the river. So the three men battled against the elements too, and the temperatures dropped below zero, and they went and came across teepees, deserted camps from the Indians, all kinds of things. This was not a good time to be out in the elements, but through the numbing cold, they continued their pursuit. So furthermore, Roosevelt says, "Finally, our watchfulness was rewarded. For in the middle of the afternoon of this, the third day we had been gone, as we came around a bend, we saw in front of us the lost boat, together with a scow, moored against the bank, while from amongst the bushes, from some little way back, the smoke of a campfire curled up through the frosty air." Again, these men didn't really think that they were going to be pursued, obviously. They thought they had the only boat and nobody was coming after them, so they were building a fire. They were not trying to blend in or hide. And so Roosevelt says, "As I glanced at the faces of my two followers, I was struck by the grim, eager look in their eyes. Our overcoats were off in a second, and after exchanging a few muttered words, the boat was hastily and silently shoved toward the bank. As soon as it touched the shore ice, I leapt up and ran out behind a clump of bushes so as to cover the landing of the other, who had to make for the boat fast. For a moment we felt a thrill of keen excitement, and our veins tingled as we crept cautiously toward the fire, for it seemed likely that there would be a brush-up." He goes on to say that the men we were after knew they had taken with them only craft there was on the river, and so they felt perfectly secure. Accordingly, we took them absolutely by surprise. The only one in the camp was the German, whose weapons were on the ground, and who, of course, gave up at once. His two companions were off hunting. We made him safe, delegating one of our number to look after him particularly and see that he made no noise, and then sat down and waited for the others. The camp was under the lee of a cut bank behind which we crouched, and after waiting over an hour, the men we were after came in. We heard them a long way off and made ready, watching for them for minutes as they walked towards us, their rifles on their shoulders and the sunlight glinting on their steel barrels. When they were within 20 yards or so, we straightened up from behind the bank, covering them with our cocked rifles, while I shouted for them to hold up their hands, in order that, in such a case in the West, a man is not apt to disregard if he thinks the giver is in earnest. The half-breed obeyed at once, his knees trembling for a second. As I walked up within a few paces, covering the center of his chest so as to avoid overshooting, and repeating the command, he saw that he had no show, and, with an oath, let his rifle drop and held his hands up beside his head. So again, I mean, they found these guys, they bring them under their control, and hurrah! 3 days in, they're successful and pretty excited about all this. But this was really only the beginning of their journey. So they couldn't tie these men up because they were pretty sure that if they did, the loss of circulation that it would cause would probably cause them to lose hands or feet. So they really just made them sit there, and they took their boots from them because they figured that would be enough to keep them in one place. And unfortunately, a bad storm came in, and the ice forced them to sit there for 8 days. So, you know, Roosevelt, it took him 11 days worth of time just to get his boat back. Um, but I think that this displayed his sense of adventure, and he really did view his entire time in the Badlands as if it was his own little West world. Which, if anybody's seen the HBO show, it's a place where wealthy people get to go and act out their wildest dreams of living in the Wild West. And I think that Roosevelt kind of had that view, that he was almost playing as a character in a game, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of people were doing, but Roosevelt did care about the people, and he cared about justice, and he really did want to live this life, if you will. So, I think that it's really funny. I mentioned that he brought the camera with him. He used that camera to take a photo of him holding a rifle pointed at his prisoners that he had taken, and it was widely published after that. And it just points to the fact that he was doing this all not necessarily for show, but it was a part of his grand adventure, and he wanted it well documented. Again, he wrote books, he's got photos, and he's just such a fascinating character. He's a politician through and through, and I think that he's more complex than a lot of people give him credit for. So that's that's it for this episode. We're gonna get into, as I mentioned earlier, the decline of the ranch in the next one and its legacy. But until then, God bless and Godspeed.